Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a quick moment as soon as we get everything set up. Thanks. All right, looks like we've got the recording going and people are coming in. So thanks for joining us tonight, everyone. Welcome to the 11th installment of the Mystery at the Library Book Club series, brought to you by Sourcebooks and Baker and Taylor. Tonight, we're streaming the event on Facebook Live as well, so welcome to our Facebook friends. I'm thrilled to be here tonight with USA Today bestselling author Carter Wilson, who's going to be discussing his latest book, The Dead Husband. Before we begin the discussion, I do have some housekeeping items to make everyone aware of. There's going to be multiple chances to win prizes throughout the event this evening. All you need to do is participate in the trivia poll that happens midway through, or ask a question of Carter, and you'll be entered to win a mystery book bundle from Sourcebooks. Now, don't worry, you'll know when the trivia is happening. And if you're participating via Facebook, we've got a moderator there. So go ahead and enter in the comments your comment in the comment section, and she'll go ahead and zoom that over to me in our Q&A here on Zoom. So don't worry about that. We'll take care of it. If you have questions for Carter, and we know you will, please put those, if you're on Zoom with us tonight, use the Q&A box for that instead of the chat. We absolutely encourage everyone to use that chat box to say hello, to make comments throughout the evening. We always like that. We like to see where people are coming from, what you thought of the book. That's great. And then if you have a specific question you'd like us to try and use near the end, go ahead and use that Q&A box instead. It just helps us find it a little easier than going through the whole running chat. So go ahead and do that, please. And again, same thing. If you're on Facebook, go ahead and enter your questions into the comments and the moderators will feed them to me over that. So all of that housekeeping stuff aside, let's go with a little bit of background on our author this evening. Carter Wilson is the USA Today bestselling author of multiple critically acclaimed standalone psychological thrillers. He is an ITW Thriller Award finalist, a 4-time winner of the Colorado Book Award, and his novels have received starred reviews from Publishers Weekly, Booklist, and Library Journal. Throughout his life, Carter has journeyed the globe for both work and pleasure, and his travels have been a constant source of inspiration in his works of fiction. Carter lives in Colorado in a Victorian house that is spooky but isn't haunted yet. Hi, Carter. I'm so glad that you could talk with us tonight.
Rebecca, thank you. So excited to talk to you as well. This is really cool.
Yay! So let's dive right into some questions right off the bat, okay? Sure. So we are here, of course, talking about The Dead Husband. Can you tell us what your inspiration for this book was and how it was different maybe from writing your past thrillers, The Dead Girl in 2A and Mr. Tender's Girl?
Yeah, maybe inspiration is a strong word. I very famously don't outline, and I write from the seat of my pants. And so I never really have a fully formed idea of what I'm going to write about, or even what I'm doing as I do it. And I sit down every night, I don't really know what's going to happen next. But what usually does happen is I usually have an idea for an opening, whether it's the first chapter or just like something like, man, if I saw this on TV, if I read this in the book, I'd want to know more. And what happens is I write that opening scene and I basically spend the rest of the book trying to figure out what that scene was all about. And the scene that I had in my mind, I'm like, I just pictured this mid-30s woman standing in front of this large foreboding door of this large mansion. And I knew that she was returning home, her childhood home, and she had her son by her side. And she didn't want to be there, but she had to be there. And that's all I pictured in my head. And so then I'm like, okay, who is this person? Why did she come home? What's her story? And then, chapter 2, I start trying to figure it all out, who this person is. And that's what's exciting for me. And that's pretty similar to what I do with most of my books. It's usually just a nugget of an opening scene. I'm like, I got to solve this, figure out who these people are.
Very interesting. So I'm going to go off script a little bit and ask you follow-up question to that. Have you ever had it where you've had this opening scene pop into your brain and then you end up not using it? Or have you been lucky enough that the muse has given you what you needed to start off with?
It's for sure I have, but it's always still related. And maybe that opening scene that I write ends up being chapter 6,
Ah, okay, cool.
ultimately. But that idea, somehow that idea is still in there.
Got it.
And it's always been the case.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. So now I understand that you actually didn't write your first novel until you were in your early 30s. So can you tell us a little bit about how you wrote your first book, how you decided you wanted to become a thriller author? What's your writing background kind of? We always like to sort of know, how did you get into this as a career?
This dovetails very nicely with the question you just asked, because I write now. The way I write now is how I did when I first started writing. So long story short, I went to college, studied business, worked in real estate finance. So that I don't know if I want to say this in front of all the library. I don't know if I read a single work of fiction in college because I didn't have to. I didn't have to take any English classes. And when I was 33, I was in a continuing education class for an appraisal license that I had, which is totally as exciting as it sounds. 8 hours in a dingy Ramada ballroom. And I posed myself a question. I posed myself a riddle just to try to figure out the answer to this riddle to kill the time. And I just, a sentence appeared in my head, kind of a murder mystery sentence. And so I spent the rest of the class trying to figure out the answer to this murder mystery, this one sentence murder mystery. And I couldn't figure it out. So I went home and I'm like, I got to figure this out. And so I started writing about it. And this turned into sentences, turned into chapters. I didn't even know what a chapter was, but they became chapters. And in 90 days, I had a 400-page manuscript.
Wow.
I didn't tell anybody I was doing this. I was embarrassed by it, honestly, because I was flying blind. But at the end of it, you look at this thing, you're like, okay, this is meaningful somehow. It doesn't have to, just because it's not good doesn't mean it's not meaningful. Maybe this is what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. And it's, and this was 18 years ago, and I haven't stopped writing since.
That is so cool. I think that, there's a lot of different avenues to becoming an author, right? I think some people are like, no, I've written books since I was a kid, or, I went and got my fancy, what do you get in writing? Is it an MFA probably? Like, I went Iowa Writers Workshop. Right. And then you have I love hearing stuff like you, that it's just like, no, like literally one day this story popped in my head and I had to get it out. That is so awesome.
And it's cool. What's interesting about it is because I have a business background, mm-hmm. I was able to then say, okay, how does this work? How do you get published? And I was able to analyze and go through. Yes. Yeah. And my first 3 books didn't sell. But the passion for writing has always been there. But otherwise, I would have given up a long time ago because there's so much rejection in this industry. I love storytelling, but how I write now is the same way. I pose myself a riddle and I spend the rest of the book trying to figure it out because that's what's exciting for me.
Very cool. Well, it's exciting for readers too. So that's awesome. Very cool. All right. So let's get to The Dead Husband in particular. So The Dead Husband is told through different points of view. We have Rose Yates. She's first person. And then we got Detective Pearson, who is following her. Rose has gone back to her family home. Detective Pearson is from Wisconsin and follows her on a cold case discovers this cold case while she's there. He's following her because she's got the dead husband. So can you talk to us about how you decided to tell the story in their voices from their different points of view?
Yeah, I mean, I knew it wasn't going to be a police procedural because I don't really have a huge amount of interest in doing that. But I knew that Rose was going to be a person of interest, and I wanted the detective to be significant enough that he had his own point of view. I wanted him to, have his own arc and his own story, and that's more important to me. Is that character arc than does the crime get solved? It's like, how does this affect you? And it's, but I knew that I wanted to write the book primarily from Rose's point of view. ever since I wrote The Comfort of Black, I've been writing a lot from a female point of view, and I love it. I like to not sound like me, and I like to kind of just discover these people. And so I tend to do that more often than not. And Rose, I had a pretty clear idea about what her voice was going to sound like. And I tend to write, first person, even present tense a lot of times with my protagonist, because I just, you are just in their shoes. And, and she really resonated with me. So I knew that I wanted her to occupy most of the pages.
Got it. And then how about the detective?
Say my microphone is low. Is
There we go.
else?
Yeah. Oh, that's better.
Is that
yeah.
better? Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry. What was your question?
So we've got Rose, and then you did Detective Pearson in third person. So what was that?
Yeah, so that's going to be right. So that's going to be a little bit more removed, right? You're not quite in their shoes as much. The voice is a little bit more distant, and usually that's a signal that I'm not as comfortable with that character as I am somebody else, or that I might want the voice to be different enough. And I was a little nervous writing from a detective's point of view, because I'd never done that before. Because that's like research and stuff, and that's not a lot of fun. But fortunately, I have a really good lifelong friend who's a detective in California, in Fresno. And so I would call him up and I'm like, I need this to happen. Is this plausible at all? Are you going to like disown me as a friend if I make this leap of faith? And so I dedicated the book to him. So that was cool. Because he was invaluable with his advice.
It is kind of nice to have someone like that you can run things past, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. Oh, it's great.
Helpful.
But I'm not a big researcher, so I don't want to, I know people who do the ride-alongs and cop cars and stuff like that. And that's cool, but I think they love the research. That's why they do it.
Yes.
And to me, it's just homework. I mean, writing is homework enough. Research is like homework upon homework. So I try to avoid it if I can.
Totally. So, as the story develops, I couldn't help but draw parallels between Rose and Detective Pearson's, both in their issues and in their interesting coping methods. They both have trauma that has happened to them, and they both kind of approach it very differently because there's a lot going on there. But in what ways was it important to you that Detective Pearson and Rose kind of came to an understanding about each other's plight?
Yeah, I mean, none of it's really important to me at the beginning, because again, I don't know who these people are. And so I'm just writing them as my gut kind of tells me to write them. I don't have any kind of plan to say, oh, well, they should have parallels here and there, because that would be very meaningful. And usually around halfway point through the book, I start to see that. I'm like, oh, wow, they both had this happen to them. And, it'll probably be much more obvious to a reader reading it before then. But to me, that's kind of the cool part. I'm like, oh, my subconscious hopefully has been working and has allowed me to kind of have these relationships intertwine. But yeah, and as you get into the book, for sure, there needs to be a level of empathy between them, whether it's, an understanding, whether it's a malevolent understanding or a begrudging understanding or whatever. There needs to be a humanity that's connecting them. And that's kind of what's important to me. I mean, I tend to be much more character driven, I think. So I love to see how the characters interplay with each other and have that level of like humanity branching between them. I think that's the most enjoyable thing for me when I'm writing something.
I think that shows through to the readers as well. I know, that's sort of my takeaway that I had from the book, especially near the end where they have their final confrontation, was that these two characters had sort of been dancing around each other. Rose is trying to get away from him. The detective is trying to get deeper. And at the end, they really have to come together and just understand where the other one is coming from before everything can finally, be all laid out. So, yeah.
Yeah. Emotion in books and as a reader is more important to me than what actually happens. So, to the chagrin of some of my readers who say like that ending was unclear, I need a tidy ending. To me, the endings are emotional. And if I feel that emotion, then I know the book is done, whether or not it's wrapped things up nicely or not.
Got it. All right. So you have said before that you write a lot about memory in your books. How did you incorporate this theme into The Dead Husband? And how do you think memory was instrumental to the plot?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so yeah, I'm fascinated by memory. I think memory, not in no small part because my father passed from early onset Alzheimer's, so he was 69, and that was a total aberration in my family, and so that was a really impactful event. And just the idea of losing your memory, because memory, I'm interested in things that are both beautiful and haunting at the same time.
Mhm.
And memory is nothing if not that. It can be, you're trapped in your own mind, and that can be wonderful or it can be frightening. So a lot of my books always have a thread of memory kind of running through them somehow. And in The Dead Husband, it wasn't enough that Rose was returning home and being pursued as a potential suspect in the death of her husband. There had to be something from her past that had haunted her that she had to finally confront. So she goes home not just to seek help, but to confront something in her past that she just realizes, like, I'm haunted by this memory. I have nightmares about this memory, and it's never going to leave until I face it head on. So it was important that something had happened in that house, because I also wanted the house to be a major character in the book. So
Mhm.
something loomed in the history of that house, and you could feel it in its pervasive energy. And I wanted her to have to battle that memory, as if it were, in your face villain, in order to hopefully move past it.
I'm thinking of what you just said, making the house almost a character. I think that makes a lot of sense because, that's where her past is. Her dad is a very strong character, but it's the house too. It's not just dad, it's not just the sister, it's not just the family. That house is also, yeah. All right,
Yeah.
thanks for sharing that kind of insight with us. I always think it's fun to see, what's going on in the author's head when they're putting that stuff on the page. So
Right. Sometimes it's hard to even explain it myself.
you did a great job of it. So, speaking of houses, I hear that you're a huge fan of things that are haunted, which seems appropriate for
What a
a thriller
surprise.
writer to be into. So, how do you include some of your own interests like that into the books that you write? Do you try and slide things in that you think personally, well, yeah, I think this would be cool, or does it just sort of organically happen? Or tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in creepy things. I don't like horror necessarily. I'm not going to watch a horror movie necessarily, but I like I like a good creepy ambiance. And I was never a big believer in ghosts until I was in college. And I lived in a house in college that was completely 100%, no questions asked, haunted. To the point that I had voices talking not only to me but to my roommates separately without us even
Wow.
telling each other about it. And and so, like, in my books, I'm not trying to scare people, but I want people to feel a little bit unsettled. I want my characters to always be a little bit like, what's around that corner, because that's just interesting to me, because I think it creates tension, without being horrifying. But it can evoke a visceral reaction, that can really add to a scene. So there's always, like, and in this book, I'm like, the house is not only going to be a character, the house might be a little bit haunted. And it's a 1980s McMansion, but that doesn't mean, you know it doesn't have bad energy. And without going necessarily direct to supernatural, you could certainly layer in, you know just kind of a malevolence that may or may not just be in the character's head. So that's fun to do for me.
I like that. I think it sort of straddles the line between thriller and horror, which, you know,
Yeah.
it's a pretty long line, actually. They
Yeah,
share a lot of things in common.
for
And
sure.
it definitely is interesting to read things that kind of dance right on up to that supernatural line. And then maybe they pull it back a little. And that sort of, as a reader, makes me feel like, okay, there are weird things that happen in this world, and they could, like, this could happen, right? There, nobody's saying it was a ghost that did it, or it was a, you know, malevolent force behind it, but
Right.
it
And
could
that's,
be, right?
to that point, that's where memory becomes a very powerful
Yes.
force, and your own mind, because how much of this is just your imagining, in which case is not supernatural at all, and how much
Yeah.
is it real, and how much you actually have to decide that. You know, I might not ever explain that, and I have scenes where people see ghosts, and I never say this was a ghost. This is what this
They
person
don't come out on a
saw.
white sheet with holes for
Right.
eyes or anything.
Right. You know, the human mind is so able to conjure, and when you can play within a canvas like that as a
Mhm.
writer, it's great. So that's why, you know, my thrillers tend to be very psychological, because it's a lot about not trusting what you're thinking yourself, and to
Yes.
me, that makes for interesting storytelling.
Well, and as a reader, it makes for a very interesting book to read. So thank you for paying attention to that. That's awesome. So I think this is probably a good time to seg into our trivia portion. Everyone always likes the trivia. Remember that if you answer the trivia, we can see in the poll who's answered, and you'll be entered into our drawing at the end for the books. I also see I've got about 20 questions right now for us for our second
Oh, wow.
half. So that is awesome. I will use our trivia time to start picking some of those out. Keep those coming, please. I always try to bundle as many as we can together. So we'll go right into the trivia. And this is about, speaking of what we were just speaking of, haunted places. So for our Facebook Live participants, the trivia questions are going to be entered into the comments section for you to answer, and our moderators will bring that over here. For those of you here on Zoom, we've got the first one that has come up already. We've got poll number 1 about the Stanley Hotel in Carter's home state of Colorado, and that Overlook Hotel with the Stephen King novel of... Submit your answer there. We've got 2 more questions that'll pop up momentarily. And in the meantime, while you guys are answering your trivia questions, Carter, can you tell us what kind of books do you like to read? And do you have any book recommendations for us? I always find it interesting to know, especially a writer who is so steeped in psychological thrillers. Do you also like to read those for fun, or are you like, no, I like historical romances? So tell us a little bit about what you like to
I'm
read.
more the latter for sure. I very rarely read thrillers. You know, in fact, most what I read is nonfiction, and mostly biographies. I love
Okay.
biographies. I love, again, it's character. It's like, how did this person become who they became? And I love origin stories. And
Same.
it doesn't matter who
Same.
it is. It's just like,
Yes.
how, you know,
How did they get to be who they are? I
what
always want to know
happened to you?
that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And like, so for right now, I'm reading the biography of who am I reading? How am I forgetting it right now? Oh, I totally spaced it.
That's all right.
Mike Nichols. That's
okay.
the director.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that
the
just
director,
came out a
Mike
few months ago,
Nichols.
didn't it?
Yeah, totally
Yeah.
fascinating. I didn't know anything about Mike Nichols. But I mean, you know, in terms of books that influenced me, The Road by Cormac McCarthy. I mean, that taught me about language and about, you know, how to write almost poetically. You know, I'll never write like Cormac McCarthy, but just his command of language and his making up of language to tremendous effect is phenomenal. You know, Stephen King's a go-to. There's like pretty much anything, but 11/22/63 by Stephen King, I think, is just a masterpiece. Yeah, and I love, you know, and oddly, I love anything about comedy, like stand-up comedy. I love, you know, Jerry Seinfeld has a new book out. Read that. Judd Apatow has a book of just interviews of other comedians. I'm just fascinated by that. So I like a lot of different things.
I think that's great. A lot of people, I think as a writer, people sort of automatically want to assume that you must read your genre. And I think it's always fun to find out, no, like I write these really spooky, creepy books, but I like humor and I like
Right.
biographies because I like people. Like that's
I'm really
very
well
fun.
adjusted, I promise.
We all have our things, right? All right. So while we were chatting, I did see the second and third poll questions pop up there. So if our friends at Sourcebooks, as soon as they get done tabulating those results, they will pop up what the correct answers were. I was going to say, there we go. If anybody guessed something other than The Shining, I was going to be like, so good. The majority of people know The Shining, Stephen King classic. So the second question was about the catacombs of Rome. That's a very spooky place indeed. And then our third question was about Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen. And what US city is she haunting right now? New Orleans. Wow, so many people knew that. One person said Chicago. No, I think I'm the only one who's haunting Chicago right now. Sorry about that. So great job, guys. Thanks for having some fun with us with the trivia. So now let us move into my favorite part of the program, our audience questions. We always have such good stuff coming through from people. They ask just these really great questions. So the first one that I want to ask you is from our friend Donna. And Donna says, most people's histories aren't nearly as eventful as Rose's and her family's, thank goodness. But we do all carry years of baggage. So she wants to know, do you think it is possible for an adult to go home again? We know that Rose going home again didn't turn out so great for some people. So tell us your thoughts on that, about adults kind of returning to the scene of their possible crimes.
Yeah, anything you do later in life is all relative, right? Everything's a timestamp in your life.
Yes.
What was the greatest show you've ever watched in your life? Probably was something you watched when you were 13 years old, because how it made you feel at that time was greater than a much better show that you watch today. So I think anything that happens to you, especially in those teenage years, weighs so heavily on you that when you return to it, it's going to look completely different. So you'll never be able to get back to that place in your head ever. How many of us have gone back to our childhood homes, or, I moved away from LA when I was a little kid, to go back and like, this is tiny. This is nothing. What is this place that looms so large in my head? So I don't think you can ever go home. And, I think you can put things behind you, but it's just such a different palette when you go back.
I agree. Nostalgia hits hard, doesn't it?
Totally.
And sometimes punches even.
Yeah.
I completely agree with everything you just said on that. Great. Our next question comes from Judy Adler. And I actually picked this one because I would like to know the answer too. Why did you choose Milwaukee as a location for the detective? Spoiler alert, I'm from the Milwaukee area.
No.
So I was like,
that's
hey,
why
great.
I researched you, and I decided I'm like, eventually I'm going to be interviewed by this person. And, I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. I rarely write about places I know. I don't like to write about things that I know. I like to just discover whole new worlds. And I kind of just said, I could picture this person being from Milwaukee because I could kind of hear their voice and it sounded kind of Midwest. And like, okay, and I needed a city that was like large, but not like, Chicago large. So it just became that. And then it's fun because I'm like, all right, what's the deal with Milwaukee? And you get to like find out about it. So it's a great exercise.
Well, I appreciate it because not a lot of things are set in Milwaukee. So I thought that was super cool. made me very excited.
Good.
All right. So sort of dovetailing with this, locations, we have a Facebook question coming in from Hazel, who says that Bury, New Hampshire, sorry, is a made up town. Correct. And I'm
Correct.
assuming it, yes. Okay. So
Yes.
she would like to know, do you always make a place like that fictional, or do you ever tell kind of your creepy things in a real place?
So this was the first time I'd ever created a fictional town.
Oh, okay.
I usually always set, or I have always set them in real locations before. Again, usually not in locations that I'm real familiar with, and maybe I'll fly out there and walk around.
Mhm.
But so for my fifth book, Mr. Tinder's Girl, I set that in Manchester, New Hampshire, and I spent some time there. I'm like, this is right. And so I kind of got a vibe about New Hampshire. And so then I decided I wanted to create my own town for this so I could do some world building. So I knew that that was going to be like important to me for sure. And so, and when I was coming up with the name, I'm like, what's the name of this? And what's funny is when I name my characters, I look at like, I don't know, I like proper British names for whatever reason. I tend to like just Google that. So I'm like, what are names of towns, small towns in the UK? And there was a Bury. I'm like, oh my God, that's it. It's a real town. I'm like, that's totally it.
Got it. I think it's tricky when you use real places because the worry is that there is someone from that place that's going to catch you in those streets don't intersect, or that's
Right.
not how we talk there. And so it's great that you have the chance to go and visit places to get a feel for things. And I really get what you said about, like, so you went to New Hampshire and you felt like that was the right setting. It's an energy, isn't it, almost,
Yeah, it's
right?
kind of creepy. Yeah, but in like a positive way. Like it's great. It's great. It's like,
It's
oh,
a happy
I could see
creepy.
something going down here.
All right. We have another question from Donna, because I also wanted to ask a variation of this. She's wondering if you have any literary inspirations. Some of your titles have elements of horror within them, such as Mr. Tender's Girl and The Comfort of Black. Do you see yourself expanding your psychological suspense into other genres like straight up horror, or do you kind of like to keep it in that more thriller zone? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we all know, and certainly librarians would attest to, genres are very, very fuzzy. And it's very hard to say like this is straight up. I mean, you could say, okay, if there's a mystery, that means there's a body and the crime's got to be solved by the end neatly. But generally speaking, I just like to write what's in my mind. And I'm never really thinking about like, this is not conforming to whatever. In conjunction with horror, I liked I like to approach sex, profanity, and violence very carefully in my books, because I think I believe they should be very sparingly used, and when they are used, they should be you know very realistic and
Okay.
used to great effect. So I think that kind of I mean, I don't read a lot of horror, so that I think that keeps me from like I don't want to have violence after violence. That doesn't interest me. Um, I'm more interested in just here's a person who I really like, and I want to tell their story from their voice, and I want to see them struggle, and I want to throw things at them and then see what they do, and hopefully they'll prevail, because that's what's exciting for me. I want to see how they how does this normal person get through this, because it becomes, how would I do that?
Mhm.
Um, and I never think about genre when I'm doing that. But what you're doing is you're creating tension, because you're throwing pretty horrible things at a person to see how they deal with it. And then you get labeled a thriller writer,
Mhm.
which I'm totally okay with. Um, but I've actually, even my editor says I blend horror with thrillers, and I'm like, oh, okay. I don't know. Like, it's just, this is the story I wanted to tell.
I think there's a trick to that, right? Because you don't want to be pigeonholed into being one kind of an author or another, because then the expectation is there that, oh, this book wasn't as scary as the last one, or oh, he right. And so I think you
Yeah.
do a really great job, though, of, like I said earlier, walking that line. And then so they can be enjoyed by people who like thrillers as well as people who like horror, and it's a dance. So
Yeah, the key to that whole dance is not to spend too much time thinking about it.
yeah.
There are writers who are like, okay, my audience is first and foremost in my mind. And, this maybe sounds vain, but it's not for me. I'm first and foremost in my mind.
Mhm.
What is interesting to me in this scene? And that scene might get cut because my editor says it doesn't work or it feels disembodied or whatever. And that's totally fine. But I wrote it because I had fun doing it. And I hope that what is interesting to me becomes interesting to other people.
Got it. We have a couple of questions that have come through about characters. So let me sort of go into that mode here. So we have Beth, who wanted to know, when writing your books, do you usually find you have a character that becomes your favorite? And if so, could that change during your writing process?
In one book, no, rarely. I would
Okay.
say I know my protagonist is usually going to be, because you spend so much time
Mhm.
in them, that they are, whether they're, you know, very, most of my characters are very gray. So there's no one like, oh, this is a great superhero. Most of my characters have a lot of flaws.
Mhm.
But when you're writing the protagonist, you're like this, you just spend that time. And so that's the one that you gravitate to the most. In this particular book, writing Colin as a secondary character, I needed him to be significant. And so I actually did really enjoy writing from his perspective, because he was, he was a bit more, he had less life events that he was dealing
Mhm.
with, and maybe more relatable. But I didn't want him to be normal, and I wanted him to have struggles, and I wanted him to have doubts. And so I did really enjoy writing from his perspective as well.
That really takes us right into this next question then, which comes from Key. She wants to know, do you find it harder to write female characters versus male characters? And do you prefer one over the other?
I mean, so what's interesting is, like, like after a couple of books, I kind of got tired of people I know telling me like, "Oh, I totally heard you in this guy. Like this was totally Carter." And I'm like, I don't want that. And so that's kind of how I started writing from a female perspective, because I was just curious. I'm like, what is,
Mhm.
and I just loved it because I I didn't overthink it. I didn't think about like, what would a man do versus what would a woman do in this situation? Like, what would anybody do in this horrible situation? What would a
Right.
human being do? And I find that not over, and it let me escape into a voice that I don't think sounds like me. I don't think people would say, who know me, say like, oh, she totally sounds like you.
Mhm.
So it almost gave me a freedom. So I tend to like writing from the female perspective, and there's a thoughtfulness there that is, so, and how I get feedback. My girlfriend is the first one who edits my manuscripts. My agent and my editor are women, and so I get tremendous feedback. But if I'm watching a show and somebody, a woman, is gravitating towards me as a character, I'm like, what is it that I like about her? What are the decisions she's making that's interesting? And so I feel like I absorb some of that. So I think that's probably my preferred point of view.
Okay. Very interesting. Continuing speaking about characters, I have Judy who is asking, Carter, do you ever bring the same character into more than one book, or would you consider that?
Yes. All my books are standalone psychological thrillers,
Mhm.
but I do like the world build. So there might be some references to some occurrences of other books within current books. I will say, for those of you, especially who have read The Dead Husband, if you have, the book coming out next year, The New Neighbor, not only takes place in Bury, New Hampshire, it takes place in the same house. Totally different set of
Ooh,
characters. Um,
here's the
and
juicy stuff, folks.
and I started writing it again just because I'm like, I have this idea. And so, even though they're different characters, I will say that Colin makes an appearance, because the person who occupies the house is trying to figure out what happened to the people who used to occupy the house. So that was a lot of fun, but that's a balance. Like, how do I make these standalone? They're not reliant on each other, but they're related. That was a little bit tricky to do.
Well, you just answered several people that
Oh,
question
what are
of
you
what's
working on
coming
next?
up next. So thank you for giving us that special sneak peek into that. Definitely several of the earlier
I'm so
questions.
excited for that one to come out because
Yes.
yeah, and that's actually
we
from a male point of view, but it's
so that'll be really interesting. I think we
yeah,
had Michelle early on in our conversation that one of the first questions that popped up, she stated that it seemed like the book was rather open-ended, so she was wondering if you would visit Rose again in the future. And so, but now it sounds like maybe not so much Rose, but at least her house and what's going on there. So
yeah, and like
very
the
cool.
same questions. Like the guy who occupies the house also wants to know what happened to Rose, and he starts going slowly crazy trying to figure it out.
Please tell us a little bit about that. So we have, let's see, we have a couple of questions that have come through similar. So I'm going to put them together a little bit without naming them all off. But basically, people are interested to know a little bit more about your research that you do before writing. Now, you have said that you have traveled to places to, to get a feel for the town and your setting, that sort of thing. So we, librarians, we like to know this kind of stuff. How much research do you do? Do you find you maybe don't have to do a lot, or what happens when you do have to do some? Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two different camps for sure on this, right? Again, going back to what I said earlier, I have friends who will research a million things to use one of them in the book because they love research. They just love that. That's not me. Not that I'm trying to do as little research as possible, but I usually set myself up where I'm writing, maybe first person present tense in the viewpoint of somebody who isn't, an expert in a million different things. So when they turn the corner and somebody's standing there pointing a gun at them, they're not identifying the type of gun. They're saying, "Oh my God, there's somebody's got a gun and it's pointing at my head." That's all that they know, because that's all that I would know.
Right? That's the most important part of what's happening in that scene.
Right. So that being said, whenever there's a part where I'm like, okay, so for example, if I'm talking about somebody who's like somebody like me who doesn't know anything, who all of a sudden has to figure out how to access the dark web, you need to understand those steps that you would go through. So I start going through those steps to figure it out. And because your copy editor will call you out and they'll say, this isn't real. This dark web page expired 3 years ago. I'm like, oh my God, they're really doing a lot of work. So, I do as much work as it takes for my protagonist to know what they should know. Which is why I was a little bit intimidated by writing from Colin's perspective as a detective, because he's an expert in that field that I don't really know a whole lot about. So that took a lot more research than what I would normally do. But generally I don't spend a ton of time doing it.
Okay, good to know. We have a question from Kimberly, who says that she is new to reading your books and she can't wait
Yay,
to go
Kimberly.
back and read more of yours. And she wants to know if haunted mansions like this are weaved into every book, or was this sort of just a specialty for this book? Tell us a little bit more about your back catalog.
Yeah, I mean, I love the idea of, setting is very important to me. And that setting could be a room, and that room, you should feel something in that room. And I love characters who pick up on things, that they walk into a room and there's an energy there that they're like, I'm feeling something that I can't identify, but it's a little bit unsettling. So, all of my books feature, and none of them are really supernatural, but all of my books feature places that have one level of darkness or another to them that the characters are reacting to. And the Dead Girl in 2A was the Colorado mountains, because to me, like, the mountains are like memory. They can be both beautiful and horrifying. If you get lost in the mountains, you're screwed. So I really wanted to set something in the mountains that was its own kind of character. So whether it's a house or not, I always think there's that location and setting is monumental and shouldn't be overlooked.
Got it. All right. Next question. We've got Sherry, who would like to know how you structure your writing day. Can you tell us a little bit about what your process is like?
Yeah, I mean, I only write for about an hour a day.
Really?
Yeah, that's it. So, but it's a job, right? So
Mhm.
it's 7 days a week. Well,
Mhm.
hopefully not like most jobs, but it's only an hour. And the whole deal with writing is you can be talented, or you have to do it. That's the
Mhm.
hard part, is the actual getting to do it.
Mhm.
So if I don't do it 7 days a week, it's like working out. You start to atrophy.
Mhm.
But if I write a day, or I write an hour a day, 7 days a week, maybe that's 500 words. That's usually a goal when I'm actually just generating. I can have a book done in 10 months.
Okay.
But factoring into that is the idea, like all of a sudden you have to do edits on a previous book that's coming out, and that might take a whole month. So it's more about the consistency than you know spending three. Hey, I know lots of authors who spend 4 hours writing a day, and I'm amazed by that.
Mhm.
I think I would be I would be exhausted. But yeah, that's it for me. And then I have the rest of my day for whatever else.
Yeah. All right. Piggybacking onto that, we have Joan who is asking if you do outlines for your books, and do you always know your ending, or does it just kind of come to you? I'm always interested in that too.
Yeah, never. I never
Never.
know.
Okay.
Never know. I don't outline anything. I've
Okay.
tried it before and I'm terrible at it. I I I am constantly asking myself when I'm writing, what if? Like, well, what if he just got hit by a car right now? What would that mean? And I'll write him getting hit by a car, and you like all of a sudden it might unlock this whole subplot that you never would have thought about had you been outlining it. And the endings occur to me about 80% into the book. I'm like, oh, maybe this is what happens. Because they just don't. And if it's a surprise to me, hopefully it's a surprise to the readers.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
then you have to make sure it's plausible. But a lot of times I'm just writing, and I'm hoping that my brain is working is on some level towards a certain point, but it doesn't actively occur to me till almost. And there's scenes where I have huge things happen that I don't even think about until literally that page that I'm writing. I'm like, well, what if this just happened?
Interesting.
That's so much fun,
Yeah, I
because you're
bet.
like, let's kill this person and see what that means. And maybe you like end up getting rid of it, but you're like, I killed them, and now everything's changed in a way that I
Yeah.
had never thought about that before. So that can be fun.
That sounds like, I think that would be the best part of it, is just having that
Just
something
killing
comes to you and
anyone
you're
at
like,
any
hey, wait
time.
a minute, I just killed this guy.
Right.
Whoops.
I've definitely done that.
All right. So let's see here. I'm just flipping through more of these questions here. So, you know what? I'm going to come back to this. You sort of touched on it in another answer, but I want to delve into it a little further. So, we're talking about Pearson here. So, this is Sherry, who wants to know your reason for giving Pearson his tragic story arc. I mean, and I will admit, when I was reading that, I did not see that coming. I
Me
won't
either.
spoil it. We assume most people have read the book if they're here, but just in case, I don't want to spoil it. But something very traumatic happens, and you don't, like, it's I can sort of see, how you wrote it. It's not, you didn't plot it out and give us any lines leading towards it. It just happens. So Sherry is curious to know, do you think that he would have not pursued Rose so hard if he hadn't had this trauma in his life? And you had mentioned it earlier, you had brought it up and said, he needed something that they could sort of connect on, right? That everybody's got this baggage. So let's talk about Pearson and his
Hmm.
baggage. Let's get all psychological about it here.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Uh, so that event that happened to him
Mhm.
didn't occur to me until I was writing that chapter. So
Really?
that was a what if moment.
Okay.
And that just like, well, what if this?
Hmm.
And who knows why that comes to my head. And so I wrote it, and I cried. I cried as I wrote it.
Yeah.
And it was probably my, you know, it's hard. I don't want to use the word favorite, but it was the most meaningful bit of writing in that book.
Yeah. That makes sense. That makes
The
sense.
cadence and just I felt it. I felt it so much that it felt right. And I didn't understand it. I didn't understand why. And then I was done with it. I just let it sit there for a few days. And then
Hmm.
I started to realize, like, oh, this ups his stakes in a way that I wouldn't have thought about.
Hmm.
So I just have to kind of trust my instinct. And sometimes I do that and it doesn't work. It just doesn't
Mhm.
fit. But and I know a lot of people are like, why this? I'm like, I don't know why. But it felt meaningful and it impacted me emotionally. And
Mhm.
so I knew that was needed to be part of the book. And I think you can say that, it really gave him purpose, a different kind of
Yes.
purpose that became almost like a fanatical passion for him that he wouldn't have had maybe otherwise. But that wasn't planned in that way at all.
Got it. Thank you for sharing that with us. I think that's some of my most fun parts of these interviews is, I get to read the book and then we get to really find out what made the author put certain scenes in his book or certain characters in his book. So that's a great explanation for that one. Thanks for sharing that with us.
Mhm.
All right, we have sort of a dual question here as well. Harriet would like to know if you have a favorite thriller author, and we have Wendy who had said, we put Stephen King in the trivia, and it's The Shining also appears in your book. So, are you a fan of Stephen King?
Yeah, big fan of Stephen King. I mean, not everything that he writes,
Mm-hmm.
but like I love his imagination. I love, how many of his books are standalone, just fresh stories. And I will say, I go to the Stanley Hotel, which the Overlook was based on. I go there every year, and I stay in an actual designated haunted room.
Do you have a drink at the bar?
I drink at the bar, and then I spend the night. And there's 8 designated haunted rooms in the Stanley Hotel, and that's always fun. Um, I love all sorts of different writers. I don't read a lot of thrillers. I will say when something like Gone Girl comes out and I'm told to read it, I tend to be like, okay, I guess I'll read this. And it's hard to read other thrillers without having a jaundiced eye sometimes, saying like, oh, that's so much better than what I would have written, or like, or mine would have been better, or whatever.
Right.
But like, I appreciate fresh voices. And when I read Gone Girl, I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, that's really creative. That's really like, she nailed that. So I just appreciate books that I'm like, I haven't quite seen anything like this. Room,
Indeed,
another great book
indeed.
where it's just like, wow, this is original. I love original content.
Got it. And for those of you, when we were talking during the trivia and Carter was giving us some of his book recommendations, the fine folks at Source Books have put those up in the chat for you with little links back to Edelweiss, so you can check those out. So we've got just a couple more minutes for some questions. So let me keep finding some. We've got a question from Colleen who would like to know, have you killed a character in your writing and then changed your mind and decided to get rid of that scene? Because it sounds like you're a very off the cuff writer. So she's curious to know if you've killed someone and then decided, nope, wait, that doesn't work so well.
No, every major character that I've killed has stood.
Deserve to die.
No, most of them haven't. Most of I don't know what's wrong with me. Most of them totally didn't deserve it at all. And like I'm like, well, sorry, that's just it's I'm having a kind of a crappy day, so it's your turn.
It's your turn.
But yeah, I mean,
Time to go.
I've had full scenes that I've cut out because
Okay.
they just didn't make. And then you can post those on your website as like extra content or whatever, because
Yes.
you worked hard at them, but they just didn't really end up making a lot of sense. I'm a firm believer in editing. I think that's where the book is really born, is in your first edits.
Got it. All right. So speaking of putting extra content like on your website, we have a comment from Donna who says that your website is as entertaining as a novel. So tell
Oh.
us a little bit about the Making It Up show and where the idea for it came from.
Well, going back to what I was talking about earlier, I love origin stories. I love biographies. And so I decided I want to start talking to other writers, like not thriller writers, any writers. I've
Mhm.
talked to National Geographic science writers, whatever. I'm like, why do you do that? And people are interesting by nature. And if you can ask the right questions, you can really get some great stories. So I talked to writers of all sorts of different backgrounds just to figure out how they became what they did. And then at the end, of every episode, I don't care what kind of writer you are, we are picking a random sentence from a book from those bookshelves behind me. And we're using that to start a short story together where we alternate
Love it.
sentences for like, 3-4 minutes. And it's great because the energy that you get with this other author, it's just, where is this going? Like, what are we going to, and it could be supernatural, it could be horror, it could be whatever. Oh, it's a lot of fun. So I've been really having a good time with it.
That sounds like a lot of fun. Great. All right, we have time for one more question real quick before I have to do the wrapping up stuff. We have Beth who is asking, during your writing process, do you discuss your story or characters with anyone else, or is it a solitary exercise for you?
That's a great question because I want to say that it's mostly solitary, but that's that's not true because I immediately want to start talking about it. Like, with like maybe two people, just like because if I'm excited about it, I want to start kind of talking about it. And then, of course, your agent's going to be like, well, what are you working on? Tell me, is this going to be sellable or is this going to be just something that you're doing on a whim? So I tend to keep my cards pretty close to my vest, but
Okay.
like, I will just say, yeah, it's kind of about this. But again, I don't really know, right? Because I don't outline. So even I don't know what it's going to ultimately be. So I cannot discuss it too much. So yeah, it's mostly solitary.
Okay. All right. I'm going to sneak one extra question in here really quick.
Yes.
We have a question from Wendy who wants to know if you have ever actually seen a ghost.
I haven't seen a ghost. I've heard a ghost. I heard her whisper in my ear as I was just falling asleep at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon as a 20-year-old junior in college. And I freaked out and I didn't tell my roommate Donna, and then the next day I came home back to the apartment, back to this house, and she was in tears. And I said, what's going on? And she said, I heard a woman talking to me. And then I told her that it happened to me, and then she moved out. Donna moved out.
See you
She's
later.
like, I am done. So now I was stuck for the rest of the semester in this freaking haunted house. Oh, it was terrible.
All alone in the haunted house.
Yeah, and other things happened. It was a formative year.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that little tidbit with us. We always like that kind of stuff. Awesome. So thank you. We are just about out of time here. Carter, thank you so much for spending the evening chatting with me. This was great.
Logged on, and I appreciate it.
Yes, well, we appreciate you making the time to talk with us. And I wanted to thank all of our attendees. We could not do this without you, of course, because I would just be speaking into the screen with no one there. So thank you for always joining us for these. Thank you for your really interesting and insightful questions. And Carter, thank you for volleying those right back to everybody. Those were great. It has been a pleasure talking to all of you tonight. I wanted to let you know, if you're looking at the chat there, we've got the winners' names for our book bundles. Your names are there. Go ahead and send Emily Ludoff an email with your address so she can send you out your prize. Her email is there in the chat. And make sure that you join us for the next Mystery at the Library event. That's going to be Wednesday, July 28th at 7 o'clock Eastern, where I'll be talking with award-winning New York Times and international best-selling author Claire McIntosh about her latest claustrophobic thriller, Hostage, which is set over 20 hours on board the inaugural nonstop flight from London to Sydney. A flight attendant is forced to make an agonizing decision that will change her life and the lives of everyone on board forever. You won't want to miss that book or the author interview. So the information on how to register is right there in the chat. Go ahead and register for that now so you get it on your calendar. Thank you again for joining us this evening. Thanks again, Carter. I would love the chance to talk with you again about things. This was a lot of fun, and really, I can't wait to read your next book, especially if it's going to follow in the footsteps of this one. Thank you for that sneak peek at it. And have a great night, everyone. Happy reading.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.